Every week, Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn joins Hugh Hewitt to discuss great books, great men, and great ideas. This is Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Morning glory, evening grace, America, Good Friday to you. That music means the Hillsdale Dialogue is underway. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Dr. Larry Arnn is president of Hillsdale College. He joins me today from Michigan. We are in the middle of this book, My Early Life by Winston Churchill. Dr. Arnn, it is so timely. Good to see you. Good Friday to you. Feeling well?
Yeah, good to see you.
This is so timely. We didn't set this up. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than smart. But the most important podcaster in America, Joe Rogan, hosted an anti-historian this past week. One of the guys who said Hitler wasn't so bad, and I'm paraphrasing, and Churchill was not so good. And I listened to Matt Continetti, one of my favorite younger public intellectuals, say the problem is the audience for podcasts, the 18 to 30-year-old, primarily men, don't know anything and don't trust anyone. And they don't know that Churchill was the hero. So I'm glad we're doing a lot of Churchill this year, because Churchill was, I think, easily the most important hero of the 20th century, maybe the most important man of the millennium. Some people would argue Martin Luther. What do you think about this outbreak of anti-Churchill rhetoric?
Is this Daryl Cooper? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he'd have a wonderful case if it was true, but it isn't. I mean, he gets things wrong, like when Churchill was in power and whether Churchill did this or that. So I think I know why it starts. I don't know, but we have spent some trillions of dollars building democracy in Iraq and Afghanistan, which have never had it and don't have it now. And we did that in part in the name of Winston Churchill. Confused about that because Winston Churchill was in fact in charge of Iraq and fought in Afghanistan. In this book, The Fighting in Afghanistan comes up. And he specifically refused to take a long-term British rule in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he didn't labor to build democracy there because he didn't think they wanted it.
This is why I'm so glad we're talking about him, so that there is a very elaborate record laid down. And for those of you who are new, I just added 3 affiliates, Dr. Arnn, for example, in the Hudson Valley in New York, and they haven't heard of Hillsdale Dialogue before. Every Friday we go very high. Hillsdale is the lantern of the North. It's the hope of the future of the country because they revere the Constitution there. They revere liberty. It's the place you want your kids to go if they're smart enough and willing to work and actually learn the great books and learn everything that matters. Hillsdale has become the new Ivy League all-in-one college, and it's the best college in America. You can read everything about it at hillsdale.edu. But Dr. Arnn modestly does not bring this up, but he's the equal of any Churchill scholar on the planet. One of the official biographers of Winston Churchill, along with Sir Martin Gilbert. There are so many Churchill papers and Gilbert papers at Hillsdale. I think they probably built a separate building. Are they in their own building, Dr. Arnn?
No, but they take up a lot of room.
Yeah,
they're in our archive building.
Well,
and
someone should give you a Churchill building. How much does it cost to build a Churchill building?
Millions.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That would be worth probably doing. Don't put your name on it. Build a building to Winston Churchill at Hillsdale. But since Churchill is under assault, it's just very serendipitous. We are reading the book that he wrote called My Early Life, and we're on part 3. And he's going to India. We've covered his education in parts 1 and 2. He's out of the military academy. He's going to India, and he gets to India, and he has an accident, a serious accident. He dislocates his shoulder. Explain to people why this might save his life later.
Well, he was a audacious young soldier and kept getting himself into places of danger. And in 1888, he was in a cavalry charge, the last one that the British ever did. And they were at the Battle of Omdurman, way down the south end of the Nile outside Khartoum, the capital of Sudan to this day. And the cavalry, the British had destroyed most of a dervish army with artillery and machine guns, which is horrific to Churchill. They charged across open ground and didn't understand what was going to happen to them. And then there began this battle happens on a plain south of Khartoum, which is a kind of fortified city. And so then there began a race of the remaining dervish forces and British forces to get to the gates of the city so they couldn't get in there and hole up. And so Churchill's in the cavalry regiment that is detailed to impede their flight. And so they're in the desert, and the desert, if you've been in the desert, lots of deserts in Southern California, there are a lot of places where it looks flat, but in fact there are undulations. And because the tones of the topography are such, you can't really see. And so they thought the British, they mounted a charge, this unit that Churchill was in, 21st Lancers. And they go charging at them, and they thought they were charging about 150 guys. And then they found out that there was a depression, and the guys they could see were at the top of the depression, but they go in cutting, there are 3,000 of them down there. And they're surrounded, and they cut their way through and turn around and cut their way back and then head for the city. And a lot of British were killed, a lot of dervishes. They were called dervishes. This Arab army was called dervishes. A lot of them were killed. Churchill was not killed, and the reason was he had permission to use a pistol instead of a saber because his shoulder was hurt. And he writes about it in this book, and he says, if you're in a big battle and you're bleeding, or your horse is bleeding, or your reins are cut, everybody gets terribly brave and comes running up to you to fight you. That's a good way to get killed. Whereas if somebody comes up to you and you shoot him in the face with your pistol, not many come.
He has a Mauser. He loves this Mauser.
Yeah,
he keeps his Mauser forever. I want to read the quote. The accident that he had in India when he dislocated his shoulder was a serious piece of bad luck. However, you can never tell whether any bad luck may not, after all, turn out to be good luck. Perhaps it was at the charge of Omdurman. I had been able to use a sword instead of having to use a modern weapon like a Mauser pistol. My story might never have gotten so far in the telling. Life is as a whole, and luck is as a whole, and no part of them can be separated from the rest of it. That's a wonderful way to approach bad luck, Dr. Arnn, because bad things are going to happen to good people.
Churchill was not at all a stoic, but he did have that stoic attitude. He lots of times in his life he writes lovely things about it. There was an election in Britain in 1935, and he had been opposing the government, the conservative government. He was a conservative, and the alternative was the socialist, and he disliked them intensely. So he didn't have anywhere to go. And they were following a policy of first appeasement, and second, for a long time, disarmament in the 1930s, and then tawdry and slow rearmament. And he's fighting them. And he's making headway, too, because he writes, and that's one of the things, by the way, that's wrong about Darrell Cooper. Churchill fought, and he was at the center, and the ruling center of both world wars, and prime minister in most of the second one. But he resisted those wars. He tried to prevent them like crazy. He always called the Second World War the unnecessary war. If Britain had done the things that it should have done in the 30s, it wouldn't have happened. And that was rearm. And then we could oppose Hitler with overwhelming force because the German army was weak at the beginning of the 1930s, and it was very powerful by 1939 when the big war broke out. Well, Churchill is getting headway. He's making alliances, he's publishing, he's drawing large crowds, and he's peeling off people one by one in the House of Commons. And so Stanley Baldwin, who is a very clever man and the head of the Conservative Party, he went to Churchill and implied that if Churchill would support the government in the election, Churchill would have a place. He didn't say, he implied. And so Churchill did support the government. He probably would have anyway because he didn't want the socialists. And then after the election was over, the Conservatives won handsomely. And that government, by the way, would last until the end of the Second World War in 1945. and Churchill would be the head of it for the last 4.5 years. But they stiffed him in 1935. They didn't give him a job, and he was downcast. And then he writes of it later, and it's exactly parallel to this thing about the shoulder. He said, but if I had joined the government at that time, I would have been complicit in the policies that led to the outbreak of the war.
Yeah.
Above me beat the invisible wings, he said. So that looked like a devastating
for a
thing
long
in his
time.
career.
For a long time. Let me ask you something.
Very lucky.
For a long time, he was in the wilderness. We'll come back and talk about that. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. All the prior Hillsdale dialogues, all of them, are collected at Hugh, F-O-R, Hillsdale.com, Hugh for Hillsdale.com. Stay tuned. Dr. Arnn will be right back.
Hey there. Today, I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Welcome back. I'm Hugh Hewitt. The Hillsdale Dialogue is underway. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. I'm talking with Dr. Larry Arnn about Churchill's My Early Life book, and we're talking about Stoics. You just noted that Churchill was not a Stoic, though he had some Stoic philosophy. He also wasn't, I can't think of the word, I've been trying to find the word, people who reject luxury, who want to dress simply, and he's not...
Ascetic.
Yeah, he's not an ascetic, because he said... When he goes to India, he has a subaltern's household, has a butler, a dressing boy, a head of groom. Princes could live no better than we. And he plays a lot of polo. And after 48 hours of intensive study, I had formed a highly favorable opinion of India. He likes India.
Yeah, he did. He did and he didn't. Churchill, especially when he was young, Churchill was an incredibly active man. Incredibly thoughtful man. He was, in my opinion, a contemplative man, and he wrote things to prove it. But even that he did in a hurry, and so he got tired of India. It's in this book, and what he did was, everybody else took a long nap in the afternoon in India. It's very hot in India, humid, and what he did in those times was he started seriously his education.
Well, you mentioned that last week, and I held you off because I wanted to focus on it this week. He was 22, quote, when the desire for learning came upon me. Now, you've been a teacher for a long time. How long have you been a teacher for, Larry Arnn?
25 years.
So, longer than that. You were teaching me in 1990.
Well, I became a regular classroom teacher when I became a college president, which is the only job I've ever had in a college. And but before that, people say of me that I was always lecturing.
Yeah.
I'm an annoying person.
No, you've always been teaching. And so I wonder how many young people start at 22. When have you seen the curiosity bulb go off in people? The desire to learn. That's what Churchill's talking about. He suddenly realized he didn't know much outside of what he knew, and he wanted to know a lot of things. What age does that normally happen at?
Well, so first of all, I live in an artificial environment. I have a bunch of people who come here to learn. But boys tend to develop a little slower than girls. And it's common, this is the spring semester right now, and so we're starting our senior dinners pretty soon. And there will be one or more students who will say to me, I wish I had been as eager to know when I was a freshman as I am now. Because a light goes on. And, they come here on an an oath to be dutiful and study, work hard, and they do. But the love of it is a different thing. And you don't really begin to learn until that happens. That happened to me into college. I took a course, and it revealed to me that there were things to know that were just extremely valuable to know. They weren't a hurdle to get over, to get to the next thing. In fact, if you lived your life ignorant of them, you would live your life in a lesser way. And I learned that when I was a junior in college. I was forced into a course where I learned that. And I was a different student after that. And also the problem seemed infinite.
Junior in college is about 22, isn't it? About the same time as Churchill, the light went on.
Yeah. Well, 20, I was 20, 21. And that happens. And Churchill has an art that runs all through this book. There are descriptions in this book of things Churchill did that when people saw them on a battlefield, they were amazed. Wow, that's the bravest thing I ever saw. He doesn't tell it like that. He's pretty good about that. And it sounds like it was just an adventure and a lark, and he kind of stumbled into it. But the truth is, he was very brave on a battlefield. Well, he also makes light of his education, that he wasn't a good student, that he couldn't learn Latin, couldn't learn Greek. In fact, he got mediocre grades in both those subjects, which means he knew them some. And
he writes, here in Bangalore, there was no one to tell me about ethics for love or money. Of tactics, I had a grip. On politics, a view, but a concise, compendious outline of ethics was a novelty not to be obtained. Who was Socrates anyway? A very argumentative Greek who had a nagging wife and was finally compelled to commit suicide because he was a nuisance? ? Now, we know he knows the answers to those things, right? Do we think he knows the answers to those things? But he's making himself...
Well, no, those are... he probably didn't, Those are... and notice... That paragraph, which is a very fine paragraph, that is actually the level of abstraction of the Platonic dialogues. So Socrates is always saying, what is that thing?
Yes.
What is that basic thing? You see? And when you begin to want to know, that. And that means that, before... it's, good students, by the way. I was a good student. You were a good student. And that means we know how to make A's. And the purpose to learn is to do that. Right. And then all of a sudden, the perspective of that paragraph you just read, and the perspective of the Platonic dialogues, and the perspective of Aristotle's treatises are. Let's find out what this thing is.
It happened to me It happened to me this week. I was recommended that I interview Secretary of the Interior Doug Burgum. He wants to sell a lot of our assets. So I thought I'd better read a book called The Prize, which is by Daniel Yergin. It's been around for 30 years and won the Pulitzer, et cetera. And I don't know anything about the oil business. I didn't know it was discovered. Oil was discovered in Pennsylvania. I didn't know it was commercialized in John D. Rockefeller, and I didn't know about the Rothschilds getting involved with the Pulitzers, and I didn't know any of it. It's fascinating. It's 150 years of the oil business, and I don't know anything about it, and I'm just absolutely overwhelmed by how much I did not know about the oil business. Do you know anything about the oil business?
A little bit, yeah. I knew some of that. I didn't know about Rothschild. But here's another thing. Oh, by the way, if you just look at Elon Musk and David Sachs and Mark Andreessen and those tech gazillionaires, they're like John D. Rockefeller.
Yes.
Except they're on their way. They're going to Mars now. They're not building a railroad across America. They're going to Mars.
Unlike John D. Rockefeller is described as a man who showed as little surface as possible. He was as private as possible. Yeah. Elon Musk shows as much surface as possible. So it's really...
He does, doesn't he? Yeah.
And the other guys are pretty public too. Welcome back, America. The Hillsdale Dialogue underway. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. I'm talking with Dr. Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College, about Winston Churchill's book, My Early Life, and we're talking about how Churchill educated himself with some books in India. I want to go to Gibbon and Macaulay, because first, would you explain to the Steelers fans who Gibbon is and who Macaulay is and why they matter so much to Churchill?
Well, those are the two authoritative historians of that age. If you, in public school, you read them. And Macaulay is earlier, he's a Whig historian, and his story is of...
What's that mean, a Whig historian?
Well, the Whigs are, it's hard to say. We had Whigs in America, too, and they kind of descend from them. It's even a little obscure where the term Whig comes from, but they were the ones who were for more popular rule, and they believed in the monarchy, but more limited than the Tories, the conservatives who persist to this day. And so they were sort of reformers and liberal. They liked John Locke. The story then of the great struggles between the king and the parliament, the Whigs are on the side of the parliament. And Macaulay is such a one. And
Churchill's great-great-great-grandfather is the Duke of Marlborough, and Macaulay doesn't much like him. And as he's reading, Churchill says, I accepted all Macaulay wrote as gospel and was grieved to read his harsh judgments upon the great Duke of Marlborough. There was no one at hand to tell me that his historian, with his captivating style and devastating confidence, was a prince of literary rogues. So it's the danger of being an autodidact, right?
That's right. And Churchill, we're going to talk about the Marlborough, which is one of Churchill's greatest books. And in the beginning of that book, and I have to paraphrase it, I'm speaking from memory, Churchill, one of his motives for writing the book is to correct the record as it was left by Marlborough. And he uses roughly this phrase. He says, we cannot hope to match his sweeping his sweeping phrases. Macaulay's a very beautiful writer. But we can pin the appellation liar to his coattails.
Yeah.
And that's one of the purposes of that book, Marlborough, His Life and Times.
He reads Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics, Schopenhauer, I don't read, Malthus, Darwin. Quote, it was a curious education. I approached it with an empty, hungry mind with fairly strong jaws. So this is where college matters, because when people do get curious, if they're autodidacts, they can go off on enthusiastic gambits without Dr. Arnn and your esteemed colleagues to suggest a different book, right? That's why you need teachers.
Yeah. I have paradoxical views about that. I believe that. I mean, you could end up being Daryl Cooper, who gets a lot of things wrong. I mean, basic things, right?
Right.
Some things right. But the point is, here's a thing to know. An excellent teacher is one of the blessings of life. And when you get one, you remember them for the rest of your life. And they become your friends, and like your dad, like your papa. And then, on the other hand, it's partly chance, because when you're young, you don't really quite know who knows. So you could say that one getting a good education is entirely chance. But in another way, it's not at all, because Churchill kept thinking, right? And he read a lot of things. He writes about Winwood Reade, who writes a book called The Martyrdom of Man, and the thesis of it is that we've all been sacrificed to the cause of Jesus. We're martyrs to Jesus. And he said, and Churchill writes, because he's got a wonderful understated way about some things, he said, if I'd kept that up, I would have been a nuisance. In other words, he thought better of it.
Well, he has a great chapter. In this chapter, he writes about his religious education as well. Too much religion was a bad thing. Among natives, especially, fanaticism was dangerous and roused them to mutiny or rebellion. But he found that whatever I think and I argue, I do not hesitate to ask for special protection when I come under the fire of the enemy, nor to feel sincerely grateful when I get home safely from sea. So he's kind of a foxhole believer.
Yeah, more than that. He believed in, Churchill's views about religion are complex. Everybody's are. But Churchill believes in a protecting providence. Let's put it this way. And he believed that providence was just and had to be called providence. And he believed that providence was especially interested in him.
That's a good thing to believe, because that providence was interested in him. All more coming up on the Hillsdale Dialogue as we continue with Dr. Larry Arnn. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. All the dialogues at q4hillsdale.com. Come right back.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding. And we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Back, America. The music means, of course, the Hillsdale Dialogue. Last radio hour of the week, last radio hour of your day, I hope. I hope you enjoy the Hillsdale Dialogue. I think everything you need from Hillsdale is at hillsdale.edu. You can also sign up for the Imprimis newsletter there. Watch all their free video courses. All the prior Hillsdale Dialogues, hundreds of them, are all organized over at hugh4hillsdale.com. We are talking, Dr. Arnn, about Winston Churchill's My Early Life. Do you think he and Lincoln share a generally similar view of God?
In this way, sure. They weren't. They probably weren't Orthodox Christians.
I don't think they were.
Well, you don't think they were, right? That's another way of saying probably. Because, that's a hard thing to know, isn't it? They were both very respectful of Christianity.
And they knew Scripture.
And they believed that the Bible was terribly important, and they believed in God very much.
Yes,
and they believed that God was just, and they believed that we would not entirely please Him, and He would forgive us. So God was charitable.
But they were not doctrinaire theologians of any sort, as far as I can tell.
That's right. And Churchill thought, there's evidence. In a later book in the Second World War, Churchill writes a sentence that goes roughly, "It is baffling to reflect that," and this is paraphrased, "Christian ethics do not comport in all ways with the demands of honor." Well, that's something he'd learned from contemporary theology, which is pretty corrupt. And he knew C.S. Lewis. He offered him a knighthood.
I didn't know that.
And C.S. Lewis, there was some, and Lewis turned it down with a very charming letter, and because he didn't want to appear a partisan. Also, in a couple of private letters that Lewis wrote, it's plain that he supported Churchill over the socialist. And in one of his books, Lewis says, Lewis is making a proof that the living beings are connected in a chain, that they have some relationship, us to the animals, and the animals to each other and us. And one of his proofs of that is we look like some of the animals and they like us. And then he says, haven't you noticed that the very great statesman Winston Churchill looks like a frog?
I want to make sure we cover two more things in this half hour. The chapter on is that his self-education is amazing. He loves quotations. He gets hold of Bartlett's. I've always liked a good quote. A majority is better than the best repartee. Disraeli, right? That's one of my favorite. I'd rather have 51 than be the best speaker on the House. 51 out of 100 than be the best speaker. And his love of polo. And he is, in the middle of all this learning, He's out playing polo, which I think I've watched like 5 minutes of a polo match, but it's a hard game and it's a dangerous game. And he has to play in pain with a dislocated shoulder, and he has to hit the ball, and he scores. But as you mentioned, he downplays his feat of physical dexterity on the polo field.
Yeah, there's testimony that he was a fierce and bold, very brave polo player. And he loved it. He played until he was 50. And he loved horses. He loved riding always. So he was an adventurer. I want to say one thing about education. It's important. If you want to, because this thing about being a victim of your teachers, people who are interested in Churchill could do a good thing by reading Darrell Cooper, and then go and I mean, if you really want to learn about him, that'd be a great place to start. And then you would write down his main claims, and then you would go look up in Martin Gilbert whether they're true or not. And that would be a tremendous learning experience. And first of all, you can find out if they're true or not. You should read them both. And, Martin Gilbert's thing is based on direct evidence, right? It's a very documentary kind of history.
Yeah, you're not persuading me. I think I'd rather take the Dr. Arnn Churchill seminar. And I know we're doing Marlborough after this. And I'm going to talk to you offline about, I hadn't thought we should do the Second World War, but there's so much bad Churchill stuff out there now. Maybe we ought to do the Second World War because. Yeah,
and that's, that would be, with that book, or any book, it's good to have a good teacher, because by the time Churchill writes that book, he is the most important man in the world, or the most famous, or one of the most important. And that book is an act of diplomacy, right? Soviet Union's very strong. United States is very strong. Britain is relatively weak. And so when he writes that story, it's an excellent story, and he tells it truly, but the way he emphasizes and doesn't emphasize things is affected by the situation.
I talked to Lord Roberts earlier this week about Churchill at Yalta with a failing FDR, and the parallel between FDR at Yalta, how sick he was and how out of it he was, and Joe Biden in the last 2 years of the Biden regency is pretty striking. And there was no Churchill next to Biden, unfortunately. And nor can we rewrite history. It was a disastrous couple of years. It was a disaster at Yalta. It was a disastrous couple of years. Don't go anywhere. Dr. Arnn will be right back for our last segment on this week's Hillsdale Dialogue about Chapter 4 in My Early Life by Winston Churchill. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. All things Hugh Hewitt, collected at hughhewitt.com. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. I'm with Dr. Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College. Let me close with this for this week on this. You have pointed out again and again and again, Churchill hates war. There's a little glimpse in this chapter on his education, and he's talking about elephants and how they've been replaced by clattering tractors drawing far more destructive guns. It's never far from his mind, is it, after World War I, what war has become. It's not the Hussars. He says the 4th Hussars and the 19th Hussars don't like each other because of an obscure remark by a private soldier 30 years earlier. That's the old army. Now it's giant guns and trench warfare. He's always aware of it. Yeah. Churchill says that he writes a nice paragraph, and I have to paraphrase again, in which he says, when war was snapping flags and cavalry charges and sabers, and the casualties were light, it was the grandest adventure and something to enjoy. But then it changes, right? And now it's manufacturing, it's industrial, and the death. And, war is inevitable, in my opinion. We're never going to get rid of it. And we just have to, the best way to prevent it is to be in a position to win it and make that known. But, war is different now, too. Like the body counts in Ukraine are apparently very high. And it's a technical war, too. And we're finding that big, heavy steel things
are vulnerable.
And
to
things that are
light
being invented as weapons are sort of as the aircraft carrier was to the battleship in World War II, there are weapons being invented today that will simply render irrelevant the weaponry of the long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's what is so scary. We're entering into, what was the essay you liked by Churchill about science that will overtake us all?
50 years hence, Mass Effects in Modern Life, there are 3. Shall we all commit suicide, which is about war. And those 3 things, Churchill, look, I read a speech by the vice president yesterday, and I personally am very glad that he's the vice president. And we're going to embrace artificial intelligence. And he argues that we have to, and I think he's right. But we don't know what that's going to do.
We have no idea.
Elon Musk last week answered a question: are we going to get Skynet and the outcome of the Terminator movies? And he said 25% chance. 75%.
5 years ago, I asked Mark Zuckerberg if they could predict school shootings, and he said no. But we're going to be able to pretty soon. And I don't know what we're going to do with that data. On that note, just read the book. Read My Early Life. This is a fabulous edition. It's got William Manchester writing the opening of it, but any edition will do. My Early Life by Winston Churchill. That concludes the Hillsdale Dialogue for this week. Go over to hillsdale.edu. For everything Hillsdale, have a great weekend. Thank you, Harley. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Dwayne. Thank you, Dr. Larry Arnn. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Talk to you on Monday on the next Hugh Hewitt Show.
Thanks for listening to the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. For more information about Hillsdale College, head to hillsdale.edu.